All right. Well, in the spirit of starting on time, we have so many things to cover. This is going to be great. Data privacy and a look at the NIST privacy framework 1.0. I think that 1.0 is very, it means a lot, right? Because we are going to be celebrating. We know January 16th was the very first anniversary of the NIST privacy framework. We're going to be handling all of that today on this very exciting webinar. With that said, let's go to our next slide. Great, great. Before we get started, just a couple reminders to qualify for CPE. Please respond to the polling questions. If you have any technical difficulties, there's the email address. And yes, questions. We love your questions. Please submit those via the chat. And what we are going to learn today, how to implement a successful global annual privacy strategy by using the NIST privacy framework, privacy expertise and technology. What is NIST and how can it be used for global privacy compliance? And lastly, how technology can help you with your privacy experts. With that, I have a lot of guests here. They're going to share a lot of information. My name is Dean, Chief Relationship Builder with Armanino. I'm just going to moderate this thing. The stars of the show, Marina, why don't you start?
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for joining this webinar today. Dean, thank you very much for this introduction. I am a Managing Director, Head of Privacy and Cybersecurity here at Armanino. Prior to that, I worked 14 years in the field of privacy in various jurisdictions, and I'm very, very happy to be with all the speakers here today and kind of discuss more than law and what is necessary for us to be privacy compliant globally. Thank you so much, Dean, for this introduction.
Outstanding. Pippa. Pippa, are you there? All right, we'll come back.
Apologies, I was on mute. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Pippa Akem, a Senior Manager in the Risk Assurance and Advisory Services, and I focus on implementing data protection programs to help mitigate privacy risk. Happy to have you on today's call.
Dylan.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Dean. And thanks to Armanino for putting together this great webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about our privacy framework. My name is Dylan Gilbert. I'm Privacy Policy Advisor with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I suppose to somewhat answer the question that was just posed in the slide before, we are a non-regulatory agency within the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. and the federal government. I work within the Information Technology Lab as a part of the Privacy Engineering Program. And our mission is to support the development of trustworthy information systems and to provide guidelines, tools, and standards to help protect privacy and, by extension, civil liberties. And this privacy framework really is our flagship resource in the Privacy Engineering Program. So really looking forward to hopefully covering it a little bit with you all today. Thank you.
Awesome, Dylan. We're so excited to have you. Aiden.
Thanks, Dean, and hello, everybody. My name is Aiden Collins, and I lead the Enterprise Business Group here at Hyperproof. We're a compliance operations platform that helps organizations manage the requirements and the workflows associated with various security and privacy controls frameworks. We manage and automate tasks such as optimizing controls across frameworks, evidence gathering and reuse, and communication with internal and external auditors and assessors. Excited to be part of this distinguished team, and thanks to the Armanino team for putting this together.
Outstanding, outstanding. We are very privileged and happy that you are here, Aiden. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we all know tomorrow is National Data Privacy Day. Go ahead and take all the pictures you want. Go ahead and share this to LinkedIn. Let's share it to social media. Let's have some fun with this one today. Before we really dive in, let's talk about some of the highlights of privacy. from last year, 2020, and what does 2021 look like? Go ahead, Pippa.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dean. I think we can all agree that 2020 was a tough and challenging year. COVID led to a sea of changes, dictating how we live, how we work, how we learn and stay connected with each other. But what didn't change with all that was happening in the world is the wave of global privacy regulations that companies have to comply with. In 2020, I think privacy was center stage for regulators, for businesses, and individuals alike. California now has what's considered the absolute toughest data privacy law of the land. I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with the California Consumer Privacy Act. Just a quick recap on the law. The CCPA governs how companies share and handle personal data of California consumers. A business must meet one of three criteria in order to be brought into scope. The first criteria is the annual revenue that you have 25 million or more in annual revenue, or you collect the personal data of more than 50,000 consumers or households, or in more than half of your annual revenue from selling consumers' personal information. So I think the key takeaway from the CCPA really is that companies must be prepared to honor access, deletion, opt-out, and notice requirements under the law, or you risk fines from regulators and lawsuits from consumers if there is a data breach. When it comes to enforcement action, the AG is very active, has been very proactive in sending out notices of violations. Some common themes that we are seeing in notices that have gone out to companies is a violation for not having clear and conspicuous link for do not sell my personal information on your main company's site. Failing to provide an opportunity for consumers to exercise their rights under the CCPA to know what personal information you have on them, or having an incomplete privacy policy, a privacy policy that does not include CCPA content requirements and presentation requirements. So keep in mind that if you do receive one of these notices, to act very quickly on it, or else you risk a civil penalty of up to $7,500 per violation. On the issue of private right of action, what we're seeing really is that there are differences in cases that are being filed. You have cases that are alleging actual violation of the CCPA provision, of a CCPA provision, for instance, unauthorized disclosure or data breach, no notice at collection, or no opt-out of sale option. We're also seeing a group of cases that are not really established, don't arise under CCPA, but arise under different laws, other laws under California, but somehow reference a CCPA section. Really, with lawsuits, it's best to make sure that you're in compliance and you don't fall victim to any of the proceedings. So California, being the trailblazer it is, also has passed a new law, California Privacy Rights Act, or CPRA, or CCPA 2.0. There are many names to this legislation. What you need to know about it is that CPRA builds on the CCPA and introduces key changes to the current law. Thinking of GDPR-like rights, you are thinking of the right to correct inaccurate information. You are thinking of a right to use and disclose and limit the use of sensitive personal data. The new law has a carve-out for sensitive personal data, and consumers can restrict how you use and disclose that information. You also have a new right around limiting whom you share their personal information with, and requiring businesses to also add not only a do not sell link, but to upgrade to include a do not share my personal information link, and also limit a link, a separate link for limiting the use of sensitive personal data. So just to keep that in mind, that this all coming as a result of Ccpa. One other thing, the law creates a completely new agency. So again, moving from the AG, the Attorney General being the enforcer of the CCPA, to a new agency, the California Privacy Protection Agency, that will take control of CCPA enforcement. Key takeaway from Ccpa: keep track of Ccipa's timeline. Know when the California Privacy Protection Agency can begin its rulemaking authority. It does have, under the current law, under Ccpa, the right to establish guidelines and rules around Ccpa enforcement. So keep track of that. And that typically happens that happens on July 1, 2021. You also need to keep track of the timeline for adopting final regulations around Ccpa. Just as with the CCPA, there will be regulations clarifying how companies may comply. And lastly, Ccpa comes into effect on January 1, 2023. So companies have a 2-year period to really ramp up on their privacy compliance processes. So when it comes to the slides moved. Okay. Oh, yeah. Very quickly on developments in the EU, you have the Shrimps case that basically led to the demise of the EU US Privacy Shield, and gives rise to standard contractual clauses. So keep that in mind. There are new laws developing in other jurisdictions: Brazil, China, Canada, India, New Zealand. The possibility of having a federal privacy regulation. And of course, you have state law that is continuing. And to the very last point on the slide, privacy in the wake of a pandemic is changing habits. And as companies, employees, post-vaccination return to work, we really need to begin to think of policies around the type of schedule, work schedule that employees eventually are aligned with. So if it's remote access, remote work versus coming into the office, you need to make sure you have more robust policies, data protection policies in place, and keep employees up to date. Next slide.
Yeah, Pippa, there's a lot of information.
What should you think of?
Yeah, what jumps off the page here for 2021?
Absolutely. On my radar is definitely Brexit. I mean, we do have an agreement, but there are changes that will impact data flows between the UK and the EU. So there is currently a provision that allows for data flow for up to 6 months, up till the end of June. So to keep track of that, and to also keep track of the EDPD, the European Data Protection Board, guidance and the standard contractual clauses that just issued that will impact how you transfer information out of the EU to the US and how companies interact with each other in the EU. So keep track of these developments, and there is much to come in terms of privacy regulations. Dean?
Yeah, love it, love it. Let's get to our very first polling question. And I think we're going to show it here in 1 second. There you go. What did you do to ensure lawful transfer of personal data from Europe to United States after the EU-US Privacy Shield has been invalidated? This is a multiple choice answer. There is so much here. That sounds pretty, I'm not gonna lie, Morena and team, you guys are asking some hard questions, putting people on the spot. So definitely, let's go ahead and give everybody a chance to vote so we all get our CPE for being here today. Give everybody about 5 more seconds and we'll get moving on. If you're listening now, please go ahead and vote if you haven't done so, and we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1.
Oh, well, Mirena, should I take this one, or do you have something to say about it?
Go ahead, Pippa.
Go ahead, Pippa.
Excellent. Really, the standard contractual clauses should be considered with the Privacy Shield no longer in force. And the EU Data Protection Board has issued updated opinions and guidelines around ensuring that your transfers meet the EU requirements for data protection. So I would say also, in addition to looking at the standard contractual clauses, you need to know your transfers. You need to know and verify the tools that you are relying upon to complete your transfers, and complete an assessment. If you are a data exporter, we need to go through a review process to understand what safeguards are in place at the in the receiving country, and to make sure that those align or meet EU data protection requirements. Mirena?
Thank you very much, Pippa. I think that you said a lot. I see that the results were very close between should we wait for the new standard contractual clauses or should we already have standard contractual clauses. In any case, please, review and carefully observe what's going on in the space in Europe, because there is a lot of changes, including in the standard contractual clauses, and there are new sets of standard contractual clauses coming.
Yeah, Marina, let's actually start going through some of these questions that we're hearing often today with everybody with their international and domestic privacy concerns. I think our very first one is, we just heard a lot from Pippa around all of this, and let's talk about it. Our business is aiming for a global reach. They must comply with so much privacy. How, do they even know where to start? How are they doing this?
They don't.
Easy answer, they don't. Okay, so what do we do now?
Exactly. I think that this was one of the main reasons why we really wanted to have this webinar today. I fully understand the concerns of the businesses about what to do, where to start. There is a lot of patchwork in the space. There is a lot of global privacy laws. In the same time, we have internet, right? We have global data already. Yes, it's true, like GDPR kinds of sets the standard around the globe, but not necessarily everywhere, including in the United States. There is a lot of differences, even though United States is getting closer to Europe. Let's say we have Korea, as you can see from what people just mentioned. There is Brazil with new law. There is, China is looking forward to laws. And basically, there is so much. And if a company starting from a startup, but even a global company that is already well established, it is very difficult to keep track on all these global requirements, or alternatively, there is so much in terms of headcount that should be involved for this to work out. And I thought a lot about this and wonder there should be a way for businesses to unify their approach in privacy and have the skeleton to start from and a beginnings from somewhere. And this is how I actually discovered NIST privacy framework. And honestly, it's extremely helpful. It's extremely helpful because NIST privacy framework, we need to have one global framework that would set the standard, which we'll discuss. And I will talk later a little bit more about that. But considering the limited budgets of the companies, considering that we want to make sure that we have structure, internal teams, we need to have a uniform approach to start with in privacy, and how are we going to look at the privacy globally, and from there to continue with a more granular approach. But yes, and NIST is a great beginning. And I would like if you guys hear a little bit more about that. And I would continue to tell you how this is used in practice and how we are using this in practice to basically facilitate the businesses and provide this start that sometimes is either not efficient, or it's either, as I said, patchwork, or a very, very expensive. We want to make sure that we got to be also cost efficient with the privacy compliance.
Well, let's get into that then. Let's talk about what is NIST and this framework, and how do we actually make it real, right? Dylan, is this just a theory, or is this something that people are putting into action today? Give us some info here.
Yeah, the NIST privacy framework does exist. It is not theoretical, and folks are using it, which is great for us to see 1 year on. It's been downloaded over 30,000 times all around the globe. So what is it? In the most simple terms, the NIST privacy framework is a voluntary and publicly available tool to help organizations manage their privacy risks. It is a law and technology agnostic document. This was a priority that we heard from our stakeholders early on in the development process, and again, something that is designed to address this issue that Morena just laid out, which is we have a very dynamic and complex regulatory landscape. We have privacy risks which are shifting all the time. And so having a tool that can help companies manage that environment was our goal. So we initiated an open and transparent development process that took place over a year's time. We gathered public comments and feedback from a broad and diverse set of stakeholders at public workshops, stakeholders representing private industry, the public sector, academia, and civil society. We released version 1.0 on January 16th of 2020. And so as Dean mentioned, yes, we're taking the liberty of celebrating the 1 year birthday throughout the entire month of January. But as part of our 1 year festivities, we've released a number of new resources, many of which I'll highlight today. But I want to begin by quickly going over the basic structure of the framework, if we can move to the next slide. So, if you already have some knowledge or experience with the NIST cybersecurity framework, these elements will look very familiar. Early in the development process, stakeholders signaled a clear interest and desire for a structural alignment between the NIST cybersecurity framework and the NIST privacy framework. So that's why we use the same triad here of core, profiles, and implementation tiers. And the core, as it says here, an increasingly granular set of activities and outcomes to enable organizational dialogue about privacy risk management. This collaboration and dialogue is at the heart of risk management, no matter what the discipline is that you're in. You have to have a discussion about risks, prioritization, trade-offs, and costs, and it has to happen across the organization. One thing that the core is not, and I'll be emphasizing this quite often, is it's not a compliance checklist. As I mentioned at the top, we are a non-regulatory agency. This framework has no force of law. What it is instead is, as mentioned, a set of outcomes and activities that we like to talk about can be used as a menu of options, so to speak, that organizations can use. They can map their compliance obligations to the core, which we can talk about in a minute as well. But the basic idea is an organization can use the core outcomes and activities to select and create profiles. They can create a profile of where their program is right now, a current profile, and where the profile and where the organization wants the program to be in the future, their target profile. And so, this is part of, digging in and using the privacy framework, and also using it in a way that hopefully will be quite similar to the way that the cybersecurity framework is used for those that are doing that. And the implementation tiers are just another communication device. It's to help organizations talk about resourcing. Do you have a workforce capable of managing privacy risks that's in place? Because it's not necessarily just going to be privacy professionals, correct? You're going to have folks that are in product development. You have folks that are in IT. It's a very interdisciplinary, and it's going to be important to have that workforce in place that actually understands what it means to manage privacy risk. Maybe that may not be in place, but building out your implementation tiers can give you a good picture of where you're at, not only in terms of how you're meeting these outcomes and activities, but also whether you have the resources in place to achieve them. Next slide, please. And so, we think this structure, we hope this structure is useful not only for making it easier to use the privacy framework and the cybersecurity framework together, but also supports what we consider to be key attributes of the privacy framework, which is that it's risk and outcome based, it's flexible and scalable, and it's designed to facilitate communication. So here, if we, for the visual learners, we have a bit of an abstract illustration of what the core looks like and how it is increasingly granular when we talk about the outcomes. I do want to just briefly mention the functions here, so you can get a little bit of a flavor of what the core is covering. If we look at what they are, they're high-level outcomes. So, as we can see later, that can be useful for talking about risks with organizational decision makers or senior leaders, because you're talking about things that maybe perhaps a higher level. If you take a look at identify, that's, much like in the cybersecurity framework, this is where foundational risk management activities can be found. Things like inventory and data mapping, activities around risk management generally, both within an organization and also taking the entire ecosystem into account, which of course is important when we're talking about the complexity of the data ecosystem, even if you're a smaller organization. If you look at the governance function, this is a function that doesn't exist in the cybersecurity framework, but it covers a lot of enterprise level activities like policy creation, workforce awareness and training, and ongoing monitoring and review. The control function gets at the outcomes and activities that are necessary to manage data with sufficient granularity to address privacy risks. So here, this is the home, for example, of a disassociated processing category, which contains outcomes that include de-identification or other technical processing solutions that can increase disassociability consistent with an organization's risk strategy. And the communicate function, this is, outcomes to emphasize the two-way street between organizations and individuals. And then finally, we have the protect function. You probably noticed this -P on all the functions. This is to indicate that they are specific to the privacy framework. However, and this is particularly relevant for protect because it has a lot of overlap with the function in the cybersecurity framework. And as a matter of fact, some of the outcomes and activities are identical to the cybersecurity framework. But this function is viewed through a privacy lens, so to speak, which is indicated by -P. Next slide, please. So how to use the privacy framework? This is a lot here, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I just want to emphasize that there's no right or correct way to use the privacy framework. To the contrary, there are many ways that organizations have used it and are using it. We tried to create, when we look at the example of establishing or improving a privacy program, which we think is one of the more common uses, we tried to create a simple ready, set, go model in terms of how to use the core, the profiles and implementation tiers to help organizations meet this goal. And so we have supplemental materials on our website, like hypothetical use cases. And we also just recently released a 2-page quick start guide for small and medium businesses Well, originally it's targeted at small and medium businesses, but what we learned through our stakeholder outreach is it's not necessarily about the size of the organization, but it's about the size or maturity level of the organization's privacy program. And so we found that even large organizations could use some assistance with their privacy risk management activities. So we created that resource for them. Next slide. Speaking of which, our resource repository. Here's a little flavor of some of the 40 resources and guidelines and tools we have within our resource repository. I do want to highlight the Ccpa Crosswalk, which we just introduced as part of our 1-year anniversary. These regulations were just covered by PIPA earlier in the presentation. But you know, a crosswalk is going to be a document, for those not familiar, that maps the privacy framework outcomes and activities to the regulatory requirements, and you know, potentially both ways, depending on the crosswalk, so that you can, if you want to start from the compliance, you know, at the beginning with compliance, you can sort of import, so to speak, the regulatory requirements and map those to the privacy framework, so that you have a starting point for building out your profile. However, many organizations want to go beyond compliance, you know, either to be a market differentiator or because they recognize that with the shifting nature of privacy risk, it's often important to stay ahead of the curve. So you can then bring in other outcomes and activities from the core to build a sort of compliance plus profile, so to speak, but using the crosswalk as your foundation. We also have a number of guidelines and tools, including our NIST privacy risk assessment methodology, which I'll touch on later, and a mapping of the NIST privacy framework to our catalog of controls in NIST Special Publication 853, Revision 5, which integrates privacy and security controls, a really significant new revision. So as you're looking at the outcomes and activities that are within the NIST privacy framework core, you can look and see which controls can be mapped to that outcome to help answer the question of how to achieve that outcome. Next slide, or maybe that's it. Okay, no, the important slide. We're often asked, well, how are companies out in the wild using the NIST privacy framework? A reasonable question, and one that now that we're 1 year on, we have the luxury of being able to answer. And so there's a couple different ways, and I'll touch on another way a little bit later on. But this is actually, I think, kind of an interesting and more lightweight approach that we learned of how to use a privacy framework, which is essentially for communication and advocacy with leadership. So this is a very simplified example, but essentially what we heard is that an organization matched their privacy program components against the functions. Recall the functions as the highest level of the NIST privacy framework core, and kind of created like a heat map, a yellow, you know, assigning red, yellow, and green tags to show where the program was today and where they thought it needed to be. So I think one interesting and important point to note is that not everything has to be green. You know, this is all about what the organization's priorities are. So in this case, they felt like when it comes to the outcomes in the control function, reaching sort of a yellow metric was where they needed to be, but they were currently in the red. And so, you know, the organization was able to take this kind of simple chart into a meeting with senior management and help to generate an aha moment of, oh, we need more resources, and to, you know, we have more to do to get where we need to be as far as our program components go. So a very lightweight effort, and you know, shows that using the privacy framework does not have to be an intensive undertaking. You can go way into the weeds. It's a very comprehensive document, but we know that organizations already have long to-do lists, so the privacy framework doesn't need to be just another thing to add on to the list.
Dylan, I love the fact that you've shown the theory, and then you're saying, hey, in the wild, this is how it works. I think we want to take it one step further, and if you go to the next slide, right, what's the value creation that's happening here, or should we say ROI of adopting this NIST policy framework?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the value proposition is going to be very important, and it's what the heart of what the privacy framework is all about, right? So if we can go to the next slide, you know, a very simple slide here, but this kind of talks about the three most important sort of areas in which we believe the privacy framework supports. And the first is, you know, this critical element of building trust, right? Trust is implicated anytime any organization or person is using technology. That's gone all the way back to the dawn of time. But, you know, I think events from the past year have really underscored even more just how critical trust can be when you are using technology. And the idea that even if you have the greatest technology in the world, if it's not trustworthy, then folks are not going to use it. And so, it's going to be very critical for any organization that's processing data to help build trust. And so what we like to say is that the privacy framework can help organizations do that by supporting ethical decision-making in product and service design or deployment that optimizes the beneficial uses of data while minimizing adverse consequences for individuals' privacy and for society as a whole. So again, the privacy framework takes a flexible, risk-based approach to privacy. And we think that privacy risk assessments can help organizations find that sweet spot between optimizing beneficial uses of data while minimizing harms. Second, the privacy framework can help organizations fulfill their compliance obligations. And really, I think just as importantly, help to future-proof products and services to respond to this changing and dynamic policy environment that we've been covering. The privacy framework is law and regulation agnostic. So the goal and the point is to help organizations identify the outcomes and activities that are mapping to their compliance obligations. And then really critically, we think, establish traceability, right? You want to have traceability with your products and services because you need to answer that really important question of, okay, well, how are you meeting your compliance obligations? So to use an example from our core, we have a subcategory called, and essentially it says data elements can be accessed for deletion, right? So one thing to note is that subcategory is written as an outcome. It's an outcome that an organization may choose to reach. It may be because they're subject to a regulation where that is something that they need to do by law. Or alternatively, it may be something that they want to do because it aligns with their mission, their priorities, and their risk assessment. Well, if you don't actually set up your system to be, so that it is accessible, the data elements are accessible for deletion, then your ability to comply is simply aspirational. So that what we try to emphasize with the privacy framework is there's a way to implement and get to the outcomes and activities that need to be done to help meet your compliance obligations. And finally, really importantly, we designed privacy framework to help facilitate communication and discussions around privacy practices with the data processing ecosystem or with individual customers and with regulators, because there wasn't really before the framework, we think a common language or lexicon around privacy risk management. It's something I'll talk about in a moment, but it's something that we intended to do is create this common language about talking about privacy risk to help facilitate this kind of communication that we think is so necessary.
Love it, Dylan. Thank you so much. That was a lot of good content. Let's get to our second polling question. Again, you need to answer at least 3 out of the 4 questions. So let's go here. Is your organization using the NIST privacy framework version 1.0 to support its privacy program? Go ahead and put in your answers. We're going to let everybody give you some time. After this, we're going to keep on going with some questions that we keep getting over and over again. And we are going to move through it a little bit. We've got about 22 minutes left and a whole lot more of meat on the bone. So we'll get moving quickly here. But with that said, let's close these polls in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like yes, we are using it in some capacity. No, we're not, 44%. And no, my organization does not use the privacy framework, and we don't intend to use it in 2021. We'll definitely have to circle back on those and see how this is going to work out for everyone. Very interesting questions there. Miranda, I think when we think about the next piece of it is, hey, this is not easy stuff, right? At the end of the day, it seems like it's time consuming, it's costly. Maybe a lot of businesses don't have the right headcount to do this. What kind of advice are we giving people today to properly address their privacy situations and concerns?
Thank you very much, Dean. Well, first of all, I would answer, we need to have a strategy. That is the number one thing. if a business, and by the way, I just saw a little question here about what about nonprofit, profit or nonprofit. If you guys deal with privacy, you need to have a strategy. Why is that? First of all, it saves money. Second of all, it reduces your risk. And third of all, it ensures compliance and provides you a structure of who is responsible for what when you are dealing with privacy. I will tell you, I see over and over again throughout the years, a lot of efforts, a lot of hard work without strategic approach of how these work and why this work is done. And that's why again, NIST I find to be a very, very good resource and a very good approach for that annual privacy strategy, simply because we think about the budgets, we think about the people, who is involved. We need to know who is involved. And just to give you an example, because from practical perspective of how I, as a privacy expert, and also my colleagues are using from Armanino, we are using NIST privacy framework. We've seen a lot of value. We've seen a lot of, we save a lot of time. We save a lot of time with the implementation, because when we do assessments, you will see there are a lot of gaps. Every organization who handles privacy matters will have gaps, ultimately. Question is, how are we going to solve these gaps, and what are we going to do in 2021 in this case for us to solve these gaps? And this is where NIST privacy framework is very helpful, because, for example, if you go to the NIST privacy framework, and you will, considering the resources, we're going to send you the resources later as well, so you can have them. But for example, inventory and mapping, you need to know where is your data, what's happening with your data, who has access to your data. And this is a uniform approach, no matter which law is going to apply. Further, business environment, who is responsible for your privacy matters. Like, you need to know who has access to that data, who are your key resources, HR, marketing, outsourced vendors, for example, or for example, consultants. You need to know what's going on. This is where NIST can also help. And last but not least, risk assessment. We have tons of gaps. What are we doing? Where are we gonna start? Yes, it's true, all gaps have to be solved, but they have to be solved in a matter of priority, you know, not generally all of a sudden. So we need to make our risk assessment and decide which gaps require significant attention. And last but not least is the training piece. We need to provide training to the personnel. We need to know what's going on with the data. Where is the data going? This is a basic sanity check to know what's going on with the data. And these are my 2 cents here, Dean, about what are we doing with the global privacy strategy. We need to have a structure. We need to have a beginning, and I think NIST is a great beginning for that. And
well, let's get into it then. Let's talk about that NIST risk assessment right now. Dylan, what are we doing here? How do we do this?
Well, if you go to the next slide, I think first of all, to do a little bit of table setting. Can you hear me? If you can go to the next slide, please. I just want to, have this slide up to just kind of illustrate, this is why we call it an enterprise risk management tool. Part of the utility we think is helping for an organization to draw this connection between privacy risk that individuals experience and then organizational risk that typically is managed at the organizational level. Because when problems arise from data processing, individuals can experience the direct impact, right? Things like discrimination, embarrassment, or economic loss. And then organizations can in turn experience follow-on impacts, things like customer abandonment, non-compliance costs, harm to internal reputation, to internal culture or reputation. And so, privacy risks and the problems that individuals experience as a result of data processing need to be made visible to organizations. And we just describe these in terms of impacts that can be drivers for how organizations allocate budget and resources to strengthen their program. And so we hope that this can help bring privacy into parity with the other risks that organizations are trying to manage in their overall portfolio. So, one thing to note when we talk about privacy risk assessment, the privacy framework is not it's not intended to provide detailed information on how to do a privacy risk assessment, but privacy risk assessment is a critical sub-process, as Miranda noted, to identifying, evaluating and prioritizing and responding to risks. And so, given that privacy risk management is much less mature than cybersecurity risk management, what we did do is build out an appendix, Appendix D, that has some key privacy risk management practices that we think can be helpful for organizations, and that may be looking for some additional guidelines. And so I can't and won't go into detail for the sake of time here, but a couple examples of the risk management practices that we do cover in Appendix D are organizing preparatory resources. So this is covering topics like role assignment, and determining organizational level privacy requirements. And then we do have a section on risk assessment. Organizations are free to use with the privacy framework any risk model that they choose. Again, this is in the spirit of NIST. We are not prescriptive. However, we do provide a model, the privacy risk assessment methodology, which helps to provide a quantitative analysis around what risk is. And so organizations are free to use the PRAM as a means to calculate privacy risk. And if we go to the next slide, you'll note that the PRAM, as I talked about earlier, is available in the resource repository. It has a list of problems and problematic data actions. These are things that I'll discuss in a moment. And it also, has a number of Excel worksheets that organizations can work through to help identify privacy impacts and the likelihood that those are to occur, and then can actually create a heat map of problematic data actions to kind of see in a visual space where, which privacy problematic data actions may be more sort of private, have more inherent privacy risk, and may need to be prioritized over others.
Awesome. I think one of the things that we just heard about in the news is, some data breaches. I know there was a big one at SolarWinds. How do we pursue, Miranda, how do we pursue an efficient and uniform privacy and cybersecurity compliance effort?
I'm sorry, I was talking in mute. I apologize for that. First of all, privacy and cybersecurity are very related. And one of the reasons we try at Armanino to unify as much as we can privacy and cybersecurity compliance, it is important because we see a lot of organizations having different teams, for cybersecurity, for privacy, data protection officer, chief information security officers. Not necessarily they have connection, not necessarily they are able to follow the same approach and the same structure, which sometimes can actually be dangerous. And this is where, we recently heard about significant data breach. The data, just as an example, for a data breach, it has a lot of cybersecurity complexities, but it has a lot of privacy complexities. There are fines if you don't notify a data breach. There are fines if you don't follow certain cybersecurity measures in place. And this is where, again, I would say NIST is really helpful. And what we are using is, because you will see that in the NIST privacy framework that there is one section, Protect, which is basically follow the approach of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which gives us opportunity to use NIST privacy and cybersecurity framework to analyze the status of the organization and create a uniform strategic plan, including from cybersecurity perspective, Dean.
Love it. So, Dylan, I'm gonna throw this back to you. So how does NIST then tie privacy and cybersecurity together?
Yeah, so if we can go to the next slide, this is a really important sort of illustration for us that we worked with stakeholders significantly on during the development of the process, which was getting to the answer to this question: what's the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy risk? And this gets at, again, this goal for us to create a common language and lexicon around privacy risk to help with the communication that we think is important for organizations that are trying to manage their privacy risk, again, with a very complex and shifting environment. So, don't need to dwell too much on some of these things, but you can see cybersecurity risks are pretty commonly understood as being associated with the loss of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And then we can have cybersecurity related privacy events, things like a data breach that may arise because of some sort of unauthorized access to data that can implicate privacy. However, we really wanted to dig in and figure out an approach to privacy risk, which we illustrate here on the right side of the diagram, which is to consider privacy events as potential problems that individuals could experience as a result of data processing. This is system, product, or service operations that take place throughout the system development lifecycle in digital or non-digital form. So we describe these data operations in the singular as a data action, collectively as data processing, and that the problems that individuals can experience, and I'm talking about both individuals and groups as part of society at a societal level, the problems that these individuals can experience as a result of the data processing can be expressed in many ways, but we describe them as ranging from dignity types effects like embarrassment or discrimination or stigmas to more tangible harms like discrimination, economic loss, or physical harm. And so, you can see the key terms defined there on the right. And this, when we talk about privacy risk, we're talking about the likelihood that individuals will experience problems as a result of data processing and the impact should that occur. And so we use this likelihood and impact language to mirror cybersecurity, but here in the case of privacy, the focus is on problems to individuals rather than threats and vulnerabilities. So again,
awesome.
Think of that as kind of a two axes that you can do a quantitative analysis on impact and likelihood.
Maybe we can quickly go through an example real quick, Dylan, if you think. I think that's the next slide. Would that help?
Let's do it really quickly. So, a more intensive use of the privacy framework and one that is an attempt to align a program with the cybersecurity framework. Essentially, what this organization did was they took the cybersecurity framework and the policy and technical requirements and the associated controls that they had already identified and ran a gap analysis. And they said, okay, let's run this against the privacy framework, subcategories and categories, and identify gaps to avoid reinventing the wheel, right? And simply map a smaller set of new requirements and then corresponding controls against those gaps. And so merging the existing cybersecurity controls with the privacy controls allowed the organization to really integrate its risk management approach into one that took both cybersecurity and privacy risks into account.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Okay, polling question 3. Here we go. We're going to have 4 of these. You got to answer at least 3 of them. So make sure if you've done this could be your 3rd one. What strategy does your organization use to implement its annual privacy goals? Aiden, you've been quiet for a while. We're about to have you talk about what technology people can use to implement privacy. And I think that's going to be very exciting. We're going to close this poll here really shortly. We'll give everybody 5 more seconds to get your answers in, to get your CPE credit, and we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1. And the leading answer is we meet internally in the beginning of the year and we plan based on the 2020 privacy concerns. We use external sources to set our annual privacy goals. That play it by ear. That one scares me a little bit. Definitely have some room for improvement and best practices there. As we move forward, Aiden, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how technology can make privacy compliance, make everyone's lives easier.
Great, thanks, Dean. And really there are 3 ways that technology can help here. Firstly, it's around process. And we heard multiple speakers refer to the increasing complexity around privacy management and the diverse range of both security and privacy requirements across different frameworks. And so it's really important to have an implementation and ongoing monitoring process that's based on solid operations principles. Both compliance professionals and the rest of the organization need to have strong confidence in a robust and repeatable set of activities that will enable both the initial implementation of the required controls and then their ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance. So for an example of that, let me see the next slide. Dylan talked about the basis of NIST privacy being risk-driven. And so, for example, here's a usable view of how risks and the result of a risk assessment can be consolidated and shared across the organization. And having a usable platform to do that supports the kind of communication and transparency that Dylan alluded to. Other examples would include tasks like assigning control owners so that the responsibility for testing controls and providing evidence is clearly understood. And speaking of evidence, removing the friction associated with managing that evidence, ensuring it can be reused and provided to auditors and assessors as needed without overburdening your colleagues with repeated requests for the same information. All of those are good areas where technology can help and represent some of the core capabilities of Hyperproof, for instance. Secondly, it's about content and meta content. Next slide, please. Being able to transparently have a system of record where controls are linked to the risks that you've identified. And then next slide, please. Those controls are further mapped across whatever security and privacy frameworks you're working with, means that you can have confidence that you're optimizing that set of controls, not running the risk of having siloed controls across different frameworks and domains. So automating crosswalk dependencies across frameworks, both current frameworks and the new ones that the business might be exploring, is a further way to leverage technology. And then finally, it's about monitoring and reporting. Next slide, please. Being able to see the current implementation status of any framework makes for a much easier task in project management, as well as providing an easy way to communicate that with all interested stakeholders.
And I do have a couple of questions here, right? Like, I mean, we've talked about headcount, we talked about cost. There's a lot going on. You know, what are the benefits of a technology like Hyperproof with regards to actual implementation of a privacy program? What are the benefits there of using this type of technology?
Great question, Dean. It's around being able to automate a lot of the tasks that otherwise take a lot of time. And that whether that's the evidence management or testing of controls or assigning responsibility or monitoring and reporting, the more automation we can bring to that, the better. And Dylan made this point clear, while NIST privacy is certainly agnostic, organizations have the real world problem of managing compliance with a myriad of different frameworks. Optimizing the controls that can meet all of those requirements is critical to being able to get this done with the least amount of resources and with the least amount of budget. And then the last part I'll make is on this monitoring and reporting. Knowing where we're at, being able to communicate it is really important. And whether that's at the level of an individual program, as we have here, or looking at the next slide, looking across a range of programs, being able to provide that holistic view makes for just an overall smoother process. And then lastly, if I can get my last slide, being able to tie all that back to the risk and the changes in risk posture over time, that's important. Dylan talks about, and NIST talks about, shifting the focus away from compliance to compliance plus. How are we meaningfully managing and appropriately reducing risk? And this perspective into that can be incredibly helpful.
Aiden, one more follow-up question is that this dashboard approach, it seems like this is the way that organizations are managing things today. Are they allowed to, allowing them to get coverage and understanding of all of their multiple pieces of their business? Is that fair to say that if you're not running off of a dashboard today, you might be a little behind?
That's a good way of summarizing it, Dean. And also it can make it clear to the organization that all the great work that's going on is clearly communicated and understood and meeting a myriad of different security and privacy framework requirements.
Very good. Very good. It sounds like technology definitely makes everyone's lives easier when it comes to something like privacy. Okay, last polling question for everyone, and we're right up against it. How are you currently using technology to support the implementation of security and privacy controls and compliance? Here's some of our answers. And definitely, Aiden, once we get this, it would be interesting to hear your take on this poll. So again, you had to answer 3 out of the 4 questions that we've put forward. And we're going to close the polls here in 3, 2, 1. You knew it. You knew it.
I did know it. We're saying many organizations use workflow tools that are time consuming and burdensome. So without sounding overly self-serving, made for purpose technology platforms can help a lot.
Yeah, that's right. Let's get out of those spreadsheets and let's make sure that, you know, we're keeping all of our customers safe. All right. We're going to bypass the last thing here, but you know what we really want to highlight most is the fact that we are going to give everyone the top tips for a successful annual privacy strategy. We're going to send out the slides to everyone, and we definitely want to invite everyone to reach out and ask your questions, right? Pippa, Marana, Dylan, and Aiden, they're all here to help you and your organization succeed. We definitely appreciate you and your time for joining us today. Please reach out. We are here to help you. We know this is complex, and it's just, at the end of the day, it's a lot, right? It's a lot of information. Please reach out. We're here to help. Thank you so much for everyone to join us.